Hi, thanks for joining Making Waves on Purpose. I'm Jeff Senny, and today I am joined by Gabriel Grant. Gabriel is the co-author of one of my favorite books in our space of corporate change and corporate responsibility called Breaking Through Gridlock, The Power of Conversation in a Polarized World. I think this book, which was released a number of years ago, might be 8-9 years ago, was pretty prescient and pretty important given the challenges we face in society today. I think he and his co-author, Jason Jay, really are onto something here. And Gabriel has gone on to do a number of other things that have been really interesting. He and I crossed paths again recently in Global Purpose Leaders, where he's been a member for a long time, and I've recently joined and am acting as the team guardian, another really important and interesting group doing great work. So with no further ado, I bring you Gabriel Grant. Enjoy. Gabriel, thanks so much for joining us. How are you?
I'm well. Thank you for asking. How are you doing?
Doing great. Excited to be in conversation with you today. You and I have crossed paths in a number of different ways over the years, and we're now reconnecting around purpose and the global purpose leaders. And I just recorded the intro to this and talked up yours and Jason Jay's book, Breaking Through Gridlock, because the number of times I mention this book is by far the book that I mention most in the space, because I think the psychological pitfalls and the catnip that we fall into to go into these, that further gridlock rather than breakthrough is fascinating and an important way to think about it. So I'm excited to be here and talk about any of these issues with you.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you sharing the work. I don't quite remember how we first met, but I remember I got a call from Sustainable Brands and they said, our sponsor at PwC says that we have to have your workshop, and this never happens. So please, what's it going to take to get you here to do a Breaking Through Gridlock workshop? And yes, I really appreciate your advocacy for the work. And we both, my co-author Jason Jay and I, he runs the MIT Sloan Sustainability Initiative. And at the time when we met, I was doing a PhD at what's now the Yale School of the Environment in sustainability and leadership, studying how people flourish or not in the pursuit of planetary flourishing, and how organizations flourish or not, and how we might endeavor to do those things to flourish at those different scales together. And Breaking Through Gridlock, we saw a lot of pitfalls, a lot of patterns of failure and breakdown, or a lot of basically sharing my own stories of failure, invited people to share their stories of failure back with me, including my co-author Jason. And eventually we were collecting lots and lots of stories of people's failures and social and environmental justice work. And we started to see patterns. And that was what led to that work, and hoping that we could show people the patterns and help people find ways around those breakdowns, which were recurring in our space. So yeah, excited to share that back then, and really excited to see your name join our Global Purpose Leaders group, to see the first email with your name pop up in it. Maybe it's been, I don't know, what has it been, a decade? Less than a decade.
Yeah. 6-7 years.
Yeah. So glad to reunite around purpose, and that my dissertation at Yale and a lot of my consulting was focused on purpose too. And I think another time I saw you was at the CECP event for chief executive officers and corporate purpose.
And also, we advocated and had you come to an Eco Partners meeting.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, the Eco Partners meeting at Starbucks. That's right.
Yeah. So what are you working on now? What's keeping you busy these days?
Sure. Well, there was a body of work. I always have a lot of projects in the hopper. I don't think they just sort of show up. I don't get to see, I've relaxed into it. I don't get to see too many steps ahead, but it's always clear what the next step is and what I'm called to do. And that was one of the, Amy Rozhnevsky, my Yale advisor, one of my Yale advisors, studied jobs, career, and calling. And I've always experienced my work as a calling. So I've always had a lot of projects that I'm being asked to help with. But a couple of years ago, I was focused on developing this body of work and using it with organizations, which I call a self-determined organization. And self-determination is a academic theory, the prevailing theory in human motivation. But colloquially, we know it by like internal and external motivation. And those concepts have been popularized. And I saw a lot of overlaps between self-determination and purpose, and whether people were flourishing in the pursuit of purpose or in the pursuit of social and environmental justice or in the pursuit of sustainability within their organization. In my research at companies like Patagonia and New Belgium, I found a lot of people, just like you would in any domain where psychologists have gone off. I don't qualify myself as a psychologist, but where psychologists have gone off and studied motivation in high performance athletes or students or the military, wherever, they find that the internally motivated folks are the highest performers. And when I was studying sustainability, performance, and human flourishing and organizational flourishing, similarly, what I began to notice was that the internal motivation was very present in the highest sustainability performing organizations. And but most of our discourse around social environmental justice, around sustainability, is actually not internally motivated. In fact, it's very rare. It's almost heretical to hear internally motivated language around this work. Most of our social environmental justice movement language and what I was steeped in fact, I'll share a story. I wrote to a listserv of self-determination theory professors that I was a part of. And I wrote something to the effect of, can people point me toward self-determination theory research and sustainability, corporate sustainability? And then I wrote something like this: corporate sustainability would be a lot easier if more people were internally motivated to pursue it. And Ed Deci, the founder of self-determination theory, I think is either he or his colleague Richard Ryan are like the most cited living academics right now. He wrote back and he said, that's not something that an internally motivated person would say. And when he sent that to me, having spent decades working on sustainability and corporate sustainability and feeling very called, very, very motivated to do so, I started writing a reply to explain how I knew I was internally motivated. And about a page and a half into my reply, it occurred to me I was writing a page and a half defense to the preeminent founder scholar of self-determination theory on why he had incorrectly diagnosed me. Right? And I had to ask, if this isn't it, what is it? Like what?
Right. Yeah, but it's interesting because you can go far down that rabbit hole. Like, why do I give my money to charitable organizations? Because it makes me feel good about myself and the world that I live in, right? Like, as I feel called to do that. So is that internal or external motivation, right? Like,
it depends.
You can go pretty far down the rabbit hole on this stuff.
Yeah. So I found in my research, you have to ask people more than the first why. Because, I feel good about myself. Okay. The most common answer is it's the right thing to do.
Which we showed to be a pitfall.
Right. Which is a pitfall in the breaking through gridlock work, was being right or being righteous.
Right.
It just wasn't effective at sharing, inspiring other people to take something on. But underneath, it's the right thing to do. And if you ask people why, then they immediately go external. They start talking about the world. They start talking about danger or risk. And so right underneath that, it's the right thing to do, which some people would say that sounds internally motivated, is actually the external motivation. And often right under the it feels good is an assuaging of guilt, or, so what we call in the self-determination theory, introjected regulation is guilt and shame. Shame or honor being, what do others think of me?
Mm-hmm.
And then guilt, like, what do I think of me?
Mm-hmm.
And that judgment, judging yourself, it's more internalized than fear. Like, I'm afraid of what'll happen if I don't, right?
Right.
So it's more internal than sort of fully external. Somebody bent my arm and forced me to do it. But it's not what we call internal motivation. It's not what we call self-determined motivation. And it's not regenerative. It's actually depletive. So the sort of the more you use it, the less you have. So that's why we're noticing like burnout in people who are working toward these causes, because the more you use introjected regulation or non-self-determined motivation, the less you have. And there's some really weird effects. Like if you're assuaging guilt, there was a study done where they asked people whether or not they'd vote for a carbon tax. And they said whatever they said. And then they took another group of people and they gave them the opportunity to recycle something. And then they asked them how they'd vote for a carbon tax. And the people that were given the opportunity to recycle a bottle or whatever it was were less likely to vote for a carbon tax. And the reason is this is called I'm blanking on the scholarly term, but effectively the recycling, if your motivation is guilt, like what will I think of me or what will other people think of me, your guilt is satisfied by recycling the bottle. And then you don't have to vote for the carbon tax.
Right.
You used up the motivation.
This is the classic I gave at the office, right?
Right.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Fascinating. Well, and it's funny because Steve Rockland and Steve is the CEO of Impact ROI, a sustainability consultancy. He's been working in the space for 25 plus years. And we've been wrestling with this idea of like, when you go into sustainability, corporate responsibility, corporate citizenship, whatever you want to talk about it, like who is your primary stakeholder? And we did about 40 interviews with CSOs. And it's interesting because there seems to be a clear divide in the space. People who think the CEO and the business, the C-suite, that's the primary stakeholder. And then others who think like the world, the outside, the external stakeholders. And in some ways, this is captured within CSRD, the internal, external factors. And I love this insight as to the more you're acting on external motivation, the higher the risk of burnout, because you're depleting there's only so much I can care about what everybody else thinks, right?
Yeah, so I'm gonna go as far as to say, I mentioned this briefly, but almost all that we do inside of social environmental justice or sustainability is externally motivated. And the CEO or the outside world are both inside or outside of you.
Okay. Sure.
They're outside.
Yeah, they're outside of you. I see what your point. Yeah, but if you change the you to be us within a space,
that's right.
Okay.
So internalization is the process in which we internalize motivations as our own. So we think globally, but we act locally, so to speak. We make something our own self-expression, perhaps. And it is so rare to find internally motivated language inside of the sustainability advocacy realm. I asked why, like, how did we get here? And the best answer I found was Margaret Mead. People have heard of Margaret Mead. Never doubt that a small group of people can change the world, for indeed, that's the only thing that ever has. Her advisor's name was Ruth Benedict. She was an anthropologist at Columbia. And Ruth was asked to study and understand. We didn't know. Our military couldn't figure out in the world wars why the Japanese were acting the way the Japanese did. We just didn't understand it. And so she was asked to figure this out. And she came up with this kind of theory that there's 3 types of civilizations. And the civilization is, why do I act on behalf of my neighbor? Why don't I just club Jeff and take Jeff's food? Like the civilization can reach a higher level of flourishing or complexity, right? If we work together, but what causes us to work together? Like and she found that there's 3 types of civilizations on the planet. There's fear-based cultures where I don't take your food because I ask the question, will I get hurt if I do this? So fear-based cultures are like, think of collapsing governments like Iraq when we were pulling out, Afghanistan when we were pulling out, North Korea. There's honor and shame-based cultures. They tend to be more Eastern, Japan, Asian, Middle Eastern. And there's guilt-based cultures. The honor and shame-based cultures, we ask the question, what will others think of me? And then in the guilt, which tend to be more Western, Judeo-Christian, we ask, what will I think of me? Maybe what will God think of me? And we can reach a higher level of flourishing, a higher level of complexity of organizing as a society using these external or introjected motivations. But Ruth said, that's it. Those are the 3 types of civilizations that we've got on the planet. So if you look into what has been the motivation, what have we leaned on as social environmental justice advocates or sustainability advocates? We've leaned on the tropes that have existed for millennia. The 3 ways that we organize societies and get people to act on behalf of their neighbor. And I'll say it again, but it was hard to sink in for me. I had to sit on it for weeks after Ed Deci sent that email. But almost all the language we use is externally motivated in this space.
That is fascinating. And it's funny that you say that, like fear, honor, guilt, like that seems to cover most of how we talk about and think about this. There is this thread of its opportunity, but one of the things that I've been talking to people about and playing with is this idea of like the business case in ROI. And simultaneously, I'm really interested in the myths we tell ourselves, both collectively as a species, kind of humankind. I love this idea of like, it's not personal, it's just business. Mm-hmm. That is just the worst possible thing we could use to excuse poor business behavior. But also in the sustainability space, we have bunches of these. I'm going to work myself out of a job, and because this is going to get worked into the DNA. Anytime you hear the words DNA in the sustainability space, you can pretty much stop listening, because you're going to get now the bumper sticker version of some corporate propaganda pitch because it's just silly. First of all, societal needs will always outpace business performance. Like that's just part of the dance. And our inability to kind of foresee what's coming down the pipe. But I think, much in the ROI space, for example, misses out that there are real trade-offs in this. And I was talking to Andrew Winston not long ago, and he said something I thought was really profound, simple yet profound, which is businesses shouldn't be let off the hook from right and wrong decisions and discussion.
Yeah. So the ROI is external, right? That's profit. That's the fully external. So, okay, we've got that language. And then there's the right and wrong. Now we're back in the introjected. Like these are the themes. These are the tools in the toolbox. Here's the thing. We know from the literature, we know from psychology, from science, that internal motivation correlates with things like innovation or pro-social behavior or deep learning or learning at all, any kind of learning, right? Integration of navigating complexity supported by internal motivation. All these things are thwarted by external or introjected motivations. So the things that we're saying we need to solve these problems, for people to behave more pro-socially, for people to be able to navigate complexity, for people to be able to innovate, for people to stay engaged and not burn out, for people to have vitality. Internal motivation, self-determination also correlates with all the personal flourishing measures. Vitality, learning, positive emotions, positive relationships, engagement, meaning, accomplishment. It correlates with all of those outcomes. And so the things that we're saying we want for our own flourishing, or the things that we're saying we need to solve these problems, are actually thwarted by the ROI narratives or the right thing to do narratives. And those are the only narrative. Like those are, so that's what, or at least they're the predominant narrative. So that's why when I went and studied inside of New Belgium and Patagonia, surprise, not surprise, they had different narratives. And I don't know if you got to attend, but I did a later workshop at Sustainable Brands and Green Biz where, we'd have a room full of 100 sustainability directors or more. And I would ask them, to work with a partner and like come up with some ideas for things that they could do to increase the motivation for sustainability inside of their corporation. And then they would text those in and we would display them all real time in front of the whole room. And so they'd text in like 200 ideas. And I would read through the 200 ideas. And each time I did it, they were all things to increase the external motivation. And then I would turn to the audience. I would say, okay, like I did my research inside of Patagonia, New Belgium, the two of the highest performers in corporate sustainability, and they don't do any of these things. Like nothing on this whole, nothing of your 200 responses is being done inside of the highest performing organization. So often what we're trying to do when we're trying to increase motivation for these social or environmental causes, we haven't distinguished internal or external or self-determined, non-self-determined. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to increase the external motivation, or we're trying to increase the introjected motivation, the things that we're familiar with, rather than we're trying to increase the quantity of motivation, not the quality of motivation. And it's a different game once it's like, oh, there's a completely different quality of motivation present inside of these industry leaders. And what would it even look like to try to increase that? Because that is a totally different question than any of these sustainability directors, the way that they were looking at it.
I think it's really interesting because couldn't agree more with you. Reporting, external. Regulation, external. ESG and investors, external, right? Supply chain, external. Like it's all external. All the levers that we've tried to play in the space are that. I'd say the one that might be different is this idea of corporate purpose. But as I've said before on other podcasts and written, it's largely become a corporate bumper sticker. Purpose is not, it has devolved from what it was promised to be. This whole Simon Sinek, and this was supposed to be transformative. And really purpose has largely become performative for most companies. And there are exceptions that prove the rule, but how do we then drive that internal motivation? And it's a collective internal motivation, right? Which is kind of a contradiction in terms.
Yeah, I want to give you three responses before I lose them. So the first one was this something you said earlier. You said one of the things that really irks you is this: it's not personal, it's business. And the reason that might irk you or should irk you is because you're defining out the possibility of internal motivation in that phrase, right? You're saying it's not, internal motivation is always personal.
Sure.
So you're writing that off out of existence when that phrase gets said. So that's one thing I want to acknowledge based on what you've shared. Another thing I want to point to is you said, how do we drive that? And the short answer is you can't drive it, because driving it would be you driving it, which would be external.
You studied well, Ed.
I mean, it took me months to notice how pervasive this was. Like, that's exactly where my mind goes. How do I drive it? That was my question on the listserv, right? It's like, if we could drive this, then, and you can't drive it, but you can cultivate it. And so the promise, the possibility of purpose in the corporation was, I thought, opening up this new terrain that, where this spark, this energy, this aliveness, this self-determination could emerge. Unfortunately, first there's a known cognitive bias where external motivation tends to displace internal motivation. I won't go into detail around that now, but just know that there's this tendency for external motivation to quickly displace internal motivation. So even if that spark was alive and was coming alive in that corporate purpose sort of movement, and I did a academic paper, one of the chapters in my dissertation about, this movement and emerging, and I think it was called something like Peak Individualism, Humanity's Existential Crisis, and the Possible Emerging Age of Purpose. So even if that sort of possibility is present, what was happening? What are you pointing to in that moment where it seemed to be getting co-opted or perverted? And I have a story where I was invited to give a keynote to CEOs of Fortune 500 companies and what have you about purpose. And and this work. And afterwards, I was at a reception and I heard one Fortune 50 CEO, actually one of the CEOs of the big 5 accounting firms, and who had all invested a lot in purpose programs around this time. This was maybe half a decade ago. They were telling these Fortune 500 CEOs how their investments in purpose had been the best investments they had made during their tenure with the organization. They were talking about attraction of top talent, the decreased sick time, the decreased turnover, the engagement and creativity innovation was up, all the things, all the kind of qualities I was pointing out earlier. And I thought, wow, like if this conversation is happening in this room, then the system's baked. I can go on and get another job. Right? They all get it now. It's all purpose. They're going to share it with their friends, and every corporation's going to become purposeful and purpose-led. Notice I use that phrase purpose-led instead of purpose-driven. But then the CEO said, yeah, all those millennials are so easy to fool. And it's amazing how, like, I had an experience, like I wanted to vomit when I heard that, right? And I hadn't turned, I was facing the other direction away from this small group intentionally because I wanted to hear what they were saying to each other after my talk and the other talks. And then I just wanted to flee the whole event. What am I doing here? I'm helping these guys scam millennials to increase their productivity and extraction. And so what happened in that moment? Like I experienced like kind of what you're pointing to, this possibility of this emerging age of purpose that was enlivening and thrilling. Like all of a sudden for me got displaced in one sentence. Like the possible future for humanity and corporations and the way we work together and my own motivation for being at this event was all of a sudden displaced in one sentence by one CEO. It was displaced by external motivation, right? And I didn't want to be there anymore. I wanted to vomit and leave. And I've thought about that moment a lot because in that moment, I decided I wasn't going to work with publicly traded corporations. I didn't think you could do it, right? I thought that we needed to find a way. I was working with some organizations exploring this perpetual purpose trust model of ownership where you put the voting shares into a not-for-profit so that you can keep your purpose past the founder, the benevolent dictator, I like to say. And I didn't know how public corporations could pursue this purpose if they're so beholden to the bottom line. And just notice, like, if your CEO says they can get up, they can give a talk about purpose, but then if that CEO got recorded saying, yeah, millennials are so easy to fool, not only would his entire investment in his own purpose program, which he was just so proud to talk about, be completely annihilated in
right.
like one. If that got recorded and played, all of his investment would be annihilated. His competitors' investments would be annihilated because their employees would no longer believe in their purpose programs either. And so it's amazing how quickly we can displace, right? How quickly we can thwart this experience of internal motivation and how it falls down when it's built like you can't externally motivate people to be internally motivated. Back to nudge earlier, you can't drive it. If for him, in his speaking in that moment, he was saying, you should have purpose programs too because it'll increase your profit. And if you say that, then you can't create the thing. So then what's this relationship because we know that profit is important, but it's like, but why is it important? How does it relate? And how do we hold profit? And what I found in my research is that all those things you mentioned, the supply chains, the reporting, the et cetera, the profit, those are all inside of the how, not the why. They can't be the why.
Right.
And so if we ask why do this, and those things start coming up as the reasons, it's not going to work. We're not going to get the juice that actually fuels not only the individual flourishing, but the organizational flourishing.
Well, let me explore that with you for a second, because you've got like impact-weighted accounts out of Harvard, which I think is a really interesting idea where we start to, and whether you like the idea of putting a monetary value on human flourishing or not, I know some people find that distasteful, but like if we're going to say the air quotes currency of business is money, and we're going to put it in their terms, okay. And let's say I did a work for a client and we did a research project with impact weighted accounts, and they found that, they had 2.x billion dollars worth of positive investment in the community through what they paid to their employees. But there was then a debit of $300 million for the lack of diversity that they had within their employee base. And so they monetized this. And for me, it didn't matter whether the money number was right. It mattered only that it was directionally accurate and that it spoke in the language of business. And I have two minds on this. One is we should change the language of business not to be only monetary. And I tend to think that. And then I also tend to think of, well, that's never going to happen. Having worked in big businesses. So I guess my core question is if we're trying to drive organizational change and we say that change has to be internally motivated within the leadership and others, but then is therefore susceptible to individual disconnects, as we saw in the conversation you heard, like, what do we do? How do we square that circle?
Yeah. So a few things. One is we need both. You can't have, like, for instance, if I was internally motivated to not have child workers back when child workers were prevalent, apparently there's a new movement in the southern United States to bring that back right now. But until the last couple of weeks, I thought we were done with that. But if I was internally motivated as like a factory manager, right, then at most, I could give the children, some more breaks or something.
Right.
I couldn't actually not have child labor because I'd go out of business. So I need the external incentives to align in order to pursue what I'm internally motivated to pursue. But they don't become the why, right? As soon as they become the why, I'm trying to think of an example. Like if I start measuring, because it's important to measure, but these are proxy measures, right? Like I could start measuring how happy my kids are each day, right? And that's important to me. And it'd kind of be cool to have a pulse on that and reflect on, what's working, what's not working. But then if I somehow tie that to, if I start focusing on the measure, like what's important to me now is actually how good that number looks. Maybe because I'm putting it on LinkedIn or because
right, of course,
paying me for it, right? Like you can see how quickly that perverts. And similarly,
and woohoo every night,
right,
for dinner.
Right. And similarly, right, if you want to have a company that is not racist, or if you want to have a company that treats people well, or if you want to have, right, then you want the measures because you want to be able to look back and see how you're doing. But if the measures are the why, then it perverts. Then people are trying to game the measures. Then, people aren't actually trying to be kind or do things that would have them flourish or have people feel like they're cared about. Like they're just trying to like get their points. Like it's a weird, and that's back to that same phenomena that I mentioned earlier, this displacement where as soon as you create the external thing, you can tend to displace the internal motivation because your attention goes now to this external measure, and we're talking about the measure, or we're talking about the profit. Not that. So the profit's got to be the how, not the why, or the measures have to be the how. This is how we're doing it. We're creating these systems, we're creating these incentives, and it's required. Like I like to say, like I want to act with volition and self-determination, like, and I want to be economically rewarded and coerced into doing the right thing, right? Like, right? Like I want both of those things, but I want a why that is not, I don't litter because I'll get in trouble, or I don't litter because, I'll get fined. Like that's not a pleasant way to live or exist, or, I don't allow racism on my team because it hurts my measure. What? So then how do we do it? How do we, and you notice like all of a sudden this is like a foreign conversation because we are used to organizing the way we've organized societies as far back as we know, right? And maybe there's some counterexamples, and I love to hear counterexamples, but the dominant societies, the societies that have become dominant and are around now, and the history we have and what influences what pervades our thinking is we've organized based on fear, shame, and guilt. So then as soon as you start asking the questions, well, how do we organize differently? Like all of a sudden we're in really unexplored territory. like, how do we organize around internal motivation? How do we keep internal motivation alive? Because we can see like there was an impulse to care for people. And then that got turned into a measure. And then that got turned how do we actually keep the impulse, keep the love and care, keep the, that internal motivation that actually gives people vitality and meaning and positive relationships and positive emotions? Like, how do we keep that present? And it's a different question. There's a lot of answers to that. And I can talk at length about how to cultivate this.
Well, we're going to have a follow-up discussion because I want to hear the answer to the question. But I think it's really interesting because in some ways we're asking ourselves, like, how can we create whys that are not easily perverted, that don't drive unintended consequences or are easily kind of manipulated or, made irrelevant by the actions to get there. Because, there is I love this idea of internal motivation. I'm thinking of a former US president who's sitting in courtrooms in New York, highly internally motivated, all about him. But maybe you're saying he's not actually internally motivated because it's all about his brand and which is externally motivated. But like the internal motivation seems to be able to go amok as well, is my
about
point.
The self. Well, again, self-determination theory, it's not doing what you want to do, how you want to do it, whenever you want to do it. It's how do people internalize social values, like pro-social values, such that they become their own self-expression rather than something such that they derive their own flourishing from acting in ways that are like sourced from love or care or creating a desirable future or who they are in their like highest quality self. Often, this ego, that's introjected regulation, right? The ego, that's part of the guilt, shame. How do I look to others? How do I compare to others? Right? How big is my gold toilet? Like that's it's not what we're. So yeah, back to the early in the call, you said, well, what if what's the self, right? If the self is just you and avoiding, kind of these lower quality impulse, like is the self your lower quality impulses that your sort of hedonic needs, or is the self you contributing to the world? And that's part of self-determination theory, is like, what are the stories you tell yourself about who you are? And that is one form, like at New Belgium or Patagonia, sometimes you ask, well, why do you do that? Like, why did you make that decision? And they say, well, that's just who we are. Right? It's not, well, because we did the cost benefit analysis and that was the way to go.
I think that's fascinating, and we need to wrap it up because I know we've got a hard stop here in a few minutes, but I want to come back and have another conversation because what occurs to me is the concept of like American exceptionalism, which I think can be an amazing driver of greatness and an amazing driver of badness. It can drive our societal kind of sense of superiorness, or it can drive our societal sense of we need to do this in the service of others and blah, blah, blah. Right. And I think there's good stories on both sides to support when, as a society, we've done that well. So, and I think that's at a societal level. I think there's plenty we could all, and I loved your idea within Breaking Through Gridlock that you started. I remember you telling the story of recycling at your home and how it was not a stressless process between your wife and yourself. And that really helped me because, I've got 20 of those kinds of stories in my house, whether it's recycling or something else, where we say our value is X and then we have a hard time kind of operationalizing that. So let's do this again. I'm so appreciative of your time and your insights. Any closing thoughts? Lead us out on a high note.
Yeah, I'll plant this seed with people. I'll say that consider that people are self-determination maximizers. Right?
Okay.
Like it correlates with their own flourishing. And the simple way to look at it is, given a choice between doing something you have to do or something you want to do, people choose to do what they want to do, right? So they're self-determination maximizers. And then the second premise that I'll see it is consider that they organize to maximize their self-determination. And so we can actually derive a theory of affirm from the psychological theory of self-determination We could say, well, if they organize to maximize their self-determination, how do we do that? How are they doing that?
Oh, that's interesting.
And so I'll just leave people with this kind of consideration to think about. Maybe we can talk more about it next time, is that you're in the self-determination business, whether you know you're in the self-determination business or not.
Right.
That is what you're selling.
And you have created a system that is not driving that. You're beholden to your investors, you're this.
Well, there's the regular system, and the regular system is I'll pay the least amount of money for the product so I can pursue my self-determination somewhere else. I'll work the least amount of time for the most pay so that I can pursue my self-determination somewhere else, or I'll invest in things that return the highest ROI for the least amount of my time so that I can pursue my self-determination somewhere else. And inside of that system, we're all trying to extract so that we can pursue self-determination somewhere else. What happens is we don't actually ever get the experience, because if in our purchasing, our working, and our investing, we're not getting the experience, then we're not getting the experience. And there's research on that. But there's this other type of system, and that is the Patagonia or the New Belgium circa 2015, 2010, where there's a different set of agreements. I'll pay more for the product because using the product is my experience of self-determination. I pay 10x for the jacket, right? And I'll wear it 10 times as long. I'll work longer for less pay. Like I'll take a job for reduced pay, and because I don't want to do anything else. Like this is what I want to be doing.
Right.
And the owners will make decisions based on their values, not ROI. There's no exit conversation in a self-determined organization. It'd be like asking, what's your exit? How do you scale your choir singing? How are you going to exit? It's like, what are you talking about? I love to sing. Right. So there's this possibility of this different way of organizing together where you're experiencing, where you're maximizing your self-determination together in that work. And happy to talk more about that at another time.
Well, we're going to have to, because now we're going to go from the challenge to the solution on the next discussion. Gabriel, thanks so much for your time and your insights. Fascinating and super important and impactful.
Thanks so much, Jeff.
All the best. Talk soon.
Sure.